Welcome back to the special lecture series on symbolic expression and the lecture series on economics and environment. We were talking about social welfare functions and how are they formulated using the individual utility functions and preferences. For individuals, we represent individual preference orderings with a utility function, and we saw how do we do that by making a graph, by making some assumptions related to environment and the market good. Now, social choice are represented with a societal utility function, which will represent the utility of the whole of the society. Such a societal utility function is called as social welfare function. In this framework, we will try to assume that there are I individuals which goes from 1 to n. So basically there are n individuals or n people in the society, each with the utility function ui defined over a commodity bundle in the economy. That commodity bundle we assume is A. Let A be the consumption bundle, indicating how much of each commodity is consumed by each individual. And each individual derives a satisfaction of utility in the form of ui as a function of A. So ui is the utility that ith individual derives from consuming a bundle A. Let W, now we have to assume certain more components like W be the function that is associated with a single number with every distribution of utilities. So it's a value, or you can say a level, that W is a level or a value which reflects society's utility or welfare. Since it reflects welfare, so we are symbolizing it with W. So it becomes a function of all other utilities of every individual in that society. So W is a function of U1, U2, U3, U4 and so on till UN. It is if we are comparing the two consumption bundles, suppose there are two consumption bundles, A dash and A double dash. A dash is a combination of various commodities of one consumption bundle, and A double dash is another combination of commodities. Now, the welfare associated as well as the utilities associated with this A dash and A double dash depends upon what preferences you have in comparison of A dash and A double dash. So if A dash is preferred on A double dash, then the utilities associated with them, individual utilities associated them, that are defined as U1A dash, U2A dash, U3A dash and so on till UNA dash. Then the function associated with these utilities, which is reflected by W, will also be preferred to the welfare function, social welfare function, which is generated by U1A double dash, U2A double dash, U3A double dash and so on till UNA double dash. It is equivalent to being societal preferred to, that the society is preferring A double dash to A dash. And such a utility or such a social welfare is referred to as Bergson-Samuelson social welfare function. And more simply you can say a social welfare function also. As you can see in the diagram, so here based on the assumptions, if we simplify the model, we have B, there are only two individuals in the society, A and B. Individual A's utility are reflected on the horizontal axis, while individual B's utility are reflected on the vertical axis. Now, there is a trade-off between the utility. Both of them, a combination of both individual A and B utilities will give you a societal utility, and that is called a social welfare function. First combination or the level of social welfare generated by using A's individual utility and B's individual utility is referred to as W naught. And that first curve, as you can see on the graph, reflects the level of society's welfare satisfaction or social satisfaction or social welfare reflected by W naught. It behaves technically the similar way as utility function, that it is downward sloping and convex to the origin, and there is a trade-off between A and B. If you move from X to Y, as you can see, there are 2 points located on the graph of W naught. So the level of satisfaction of the social welfare function generated by combinations of utilities of A and B, like X and Y. X and Y, different levels of utility of A and B, are giving the same level of satisfaction or same level of welfare for the society, that is W naught. Similarly, if you move on from W naught to W1, it means you have moved on from one level of social welfare to the next level of social welfare. As very evident, the social welfare has increased from W naught to W1. However, a very important point is communicated by this graph, and that point is that there is a difference between the Pareto equilibrium and social welfare. Pareto welfare and social welfare are 2 distinct concepts. If we in detail continue with the explanation of the graph, if a social welfare function exists to represent the social preferences, we can draw a social indifference curve in the same way as we have drawn the indifference curve for the individuals. A set of social indifference curves for the utility levels of individual A and individual B has been reflected in the graph. The first curve represents all utility combinations that yield social welfare. Now, while the first curve, which is W naught, gives the W naught level of satisfaction, which is lesser than the W1 level of social welfare. So basically, W's are reflective of social welfares, which are constructed using the utilities in turn. Now, the important point to notice in this graph is point Y. If we pick up, let's pick up X and Y, 2 points. X corresponds to the social welfare W naught, while Y corresponds to the social welfare, as you can see, W1. So it's very evident and reflective that X belongs to a lower level of social welfare, Y belongs to a higher level of social welfare. But what do you mean by Pareto preferred? The term Pareto preferred, as from microeconomics understanding, means that a person is consuming, both A and B are consuming more of, they are reflective of more of utilities, greater utilities. If you compare X and Y, at X, both A and B have lesser utility as compared to the point Y. If we move from X to Y, it means that the utility values have increased for both A and B. So movement from X point to Y point brings both A and B better off in terms of utility, and therefore this movement is considered as Pareto efficient movement or Pareto preferred point. So, and in other words, Y will be referred to as Pareto preferred to point X. And also further, it yields a higher level of social welfare, and that social welfare value is W1. Earlier, X was giving only W naught level of social welfare, but now it is giving a higher level of social welfare. So this movement from X to Y will be considered not only Pareto preferred but also improvement in the social welfare. Now let's consider the other point. Movement from point Z to, just we move on to the graph again, movement from X to Z. Now this movement, as you can see in the graph, is definitely more associated with more social welfare, and it's very evident that the social welfare has moved from W0 level to W1 level. This movement from X to Z. But what happens to the Pareto preferences? As it is evident that the value, the location X is associated with one level of A's utility and one level of B's utility. But when you move from point X to Z, the utility level of A has increased, but B has slightly reduced. All right. So this kind of a movement cannot be considered as Pareto preferred movement. So point Z is not Pareto preferred to point X, but nevertheless it has moved to the higher social indifference curve or welfare function. Thus Z is socially preferred to X but not Pareto preferred to X. So this is the interpretation of social welfare function. Once we have this basic understanding of social welfare function, we can define various varieties of social welfare functions. As you can see, there are three different important types of very popular social welfare functions. The first one is known as Benthmite social welfare function, where the social welfare function W is a function of U1, U2, U3, and that is equated to theta. That is equated to theta Ui. So theta I is considered as weights given to the utilities. It's basically accumulation of all utilities. It is also considered as it is also considered basically as a utilitarian approach, where all the utilities of all the individuals are added, Benthmite. As far as the egalitarian utility functions are concerned, egalitarian removes the inequality part from the social welfare value or social welfare function. The inequality which egalitarian considered is the gap between the lowest or the worst of individual and the highest income individual. And the last one is considered as Rawlsian social welfare function, where you consider about the utility of the lowest individual, poorest of all, the worst of individual. So the first social welfare is also known as utilitarian. It can be of different forms. All weights must be given equally, and different people's utility can be weighed differently according to based on the income category. The egalitarian utility functions, social welfare function signifies that society cares about the total utility and distribution of utility. Distribution of utility here is very important. The second term of the egalitarian utility function or the social welfare function is the measure of inequality. Specifically, the extent to which there is a divergence between the well-being of the worst of member of the society and the other members of the society. So what we do, we take out the utility of the worst of member from the other members of the society, and then we subtract it from the total utility. That's why this gap arises, this inequality gap. And then this inequality is weighed also. So this measure of inequality, which is the gap between the utilities of every individual and the worst of individual, and that is given a weight, and that is called as lambda. Lambda reflects the weight that is placed on the inequality term relative to individual's utility. So that lambda is very critical for country to country. Every country needs to decide that what weight are you giving to the inequality in that country, economic inequality. So all depending upon the economic inequality lambda, you will try to find out the welfare of the people. And that welfare will be considered as egalitarian welfare function. The third type of social utility function or the social welfare function is again a very popular social welfare function, which is called as Rawlsian welfare function. Rawlsian welfare function was named after Harvard philosopher John Rawls, who states that a society is only is as strong as its weakest number. So a society's strength basically is known by the weakest person in the society. All social welfare functions are based on individual utilities, and they can lead to very different viewpoints in the society that considers any desirable consumption point. So, as you have seen, the three different types of utility functions, the functions are all, they have a different formulas for function calculating all the three social welfare values or society's welfare function, and the functional forms are very different from each other. Depending upon what functional form are you using, you can derive social welfare function from the utility function. Still, one common point and the common aspect of the social welfare is that all of them consider the individual utilities in one way or the other. Utilitarian considered all the individual utilities at a go and together in a additive manner, giving weights to their income or giving weights to their individual utilities and uniform weights, while egalitarian takes out the extent of inequality between the lowest income person and the highest income person, or basically individual utilities. So utility of the lowest or the weakest person, the gap between every individual's utility and the weakest person utility. That is the basic way of marginalizing or uniforming all the individuals' utility. This is how you become inclusive, and this is how you try to include everybody's utility in the society and social welfare. The last one, which is Rawlsian, is a very interesting utility of social welfare function, which we will elaborate in the next lecture, which is basically reflective of the lowest utility in the society. Basically, it is the lowest utility of the lowest individual or the weakest individual in the society. So your total societal utility is reflected by the lowest section, and this social welfare function is very widely used in most of the developed countries who follow the welfare models. There are economic welfare models where they focus on the welfare of the people, and how do they decide? They basically look for the Rawlsian approach and Rawlsian function approach. So this is how we dealt with the social welfare function originating from the utility functions, and the concept of sustainability, which is very, very important to understand that are we talking about consumption of resources in the present world, or we are talking about the consumption of resources for the future generation. Are we valuing the future more, or we are valuing present more? And what is the concept of sustainability? Different people have argued different ways of sustainability. The three concepts of sustainability, then utility functions, and then the social welfare functions. The connectivity between sustainability, utility functions, social welfare function is very well established. Every social welfare function which has been reflective of individual utilities, and in detail in the next lecture we will talk about that what is the significance of each social welfare function and how the general equilibrium is obtained by using these social welfare functions. The lecture overview the notions of sustainability. It discussed various versions of sustainability concepts. An overview of individual utility functions was presented. We will discuss various variety of types of utility, but then what is the properties of utility functions for an individual under the assumptions and under the particular model. Social welfare function was derived from the utility functions, and we saw that three different types of social welfare function derived, and later on they will be used in evaluating or in deriving the equilibrium. Different types of social welfare functions and their properties and their functional forms were also discussed. The application is very interesting of the social welfare function, the three social welfare functions, and those will be taken up to derive the optimal equilibrium of the society or the economy, for this economy. Now this particular section part of the lecture, this lecture is extracted from Colstrid, chapter number 3. Charles Colstrid to 2011, and the name of the book is Intermediate Environmental Economics, and this part section was delivered from there. So we look forward for the next lecture series of related to the social welfare functions. Thank you so much for your patience.